Mercedes have made a huge mistake this season, a suspension upgrade that was supposed to solve their biggest problem, but instead it put them months behind and cost them a load of championship points. Before this upgrade, George Russell had 4 podiums in 6 races, and after, just 2 podiums in the next 8 rounds. And Kimi Antonelli went from scoring points regularly to struggling to even get out of Q1. But what was this change, and how could Mercedes get it so wrong? Well, here's a bit of context from Toto.
Somehow the performance ran away from us. And that correlates quite well with an upgrade we did. We were obviously a little bit caught on the wrong foot because we dominated Montreal with that same car, and that gave us many reasons to believe that the trajectory is right. But then since 2 months, we are seeing our performances deteriorate, and now we went back to the bits and the hardware on the car that were good, and now Hungaroring was pretty strong in terms of raw pace.
So Mercedes were having problems keeping their tyres cool and introduced a rear suspension upgrade at Imola that was supposed to solve the problem. But it didn't. They kept on trying to make it work, but it kept on causing problems. And those problems were so big that now they've gone back to the old suspension. Now, we've already made a video on McLaren's anti-dive suspension, but what Mercedes did with their suspension was anti-lift. But before we dive into understanding how anti-lift works and why it's so important for modern F1 cars, we need to understand more about the problem the team was desperately trying to fix. Now, we know that Merc had and still have a problem with the tyres getting too hot. As we know, when F1 tyres overheat, you lose grip. Then you slide more, which creates even more heat. It's a vicious cycle that absolutely kills race pace. And with these modern ground effect cars, a lot of that tyre temperature issue is directly linked to the aerodynamics. The floor underneath an F1 car generates a massive amount of downforce, but only when it's at exactly the right distance away from the ground. But when the driver brakes into corners, the car pitches, the nose goes down and the rear lifts, and so the floor moves out of its sweet spot, where it won't give the maximum downforce. Now, here's where it gets even more difficult. As the driver releases the brakes as they're entering the corner, the car pitches back, and all of the aerodynamics change again. And so the loads going through the rear tyres are constantly changing. And it's these changes and peaks that causes the tyres to get too hot. So what Mercedes actually needed to do was to stop those loads in the tyres from cycling up and down. They needed to keep the aerodynamic load going through those tyres more consistent. So they looked to the rear of the car and designed an anti-lift geometry. Anti-lift geometry fights the natural rising at the rear of the car when you decelerate. You basically angle the wishbone so the rear of the car doesn't rise up. It's similar and opposite to the anti-dive geometry that I spoke about in our video about McLaren, so I won't spend too long explaining how it actually works. But here's a normal suspension setup. The wishbones roughly are parallel to the ground. The instant center, which is where the lines meet up, is way out there, almost at infinity. This means there's no anti-lift. Angle those rear mounting points down, and suddenly that instant center moves much closer to the wheel. Now you've got anti-lift geometry. The amount of anti-dive that a car has is given as a percentage, and it depends on where the line from the tyre's contact patch through the instant center crosses the car's center of gravity height. So if you have more anti-lift, it would look like this, and if you have less, it would look like this. And McLaren have proved that this worked with anti-dive, which is the same as this but the opposite, stopping the front of the car dropping down rather than the rear coming up. But the idea is roughly the same. Keep the car's floor in the sweet spot relative to the ground. And McLaren have gone to the extreme with their anti-dive at the front. It's close to 100%, meaning almost no suspension travel. So when their drivers brake, the front of the car barely drops down, keeping the floor in the perfect sweet spot. And they've made it work. It's part of the reason why they're dominating. But still, McLaren have had issues. Norris complained that the extreme geometry killed his feel for the car. So they actually built him a new custom suspension with slightly less anti-dive to give him better feedback. But Mercedes needed this at the rear of the car because they were going to keep those rear tyres cool. Well, that was the theory anyway. But before we get into the technical details of why this upgrade should have worked, I need to tell you about today's sponsor, Saily. Whenever we're away filming, staying connected is a constant challenge, and that's where Saily came to the rescue. A few months ago, when we landed in Italy for a shoot, we had no airport Wi-Fi, no roaming, and we needed to get on the internet. And that's when we used Saily. Within minutes of downloading the app, we had mobile data up and running right there in the terminal. Saely is a super simple eSIM app that gives you instant data in over 200 destinations. You won't need to queue up for a SIM or hunt for a kiosk. It's all digital. Just download the app, choose your plan, and you're online in minutes. No physical SIM to lose or swap out. Everything happens right from your phone. They even notify you when you're nearing your data limit, so you'll always have time to top up. If you're travelling soon, use code DRIVER61 for 15% off your plan. Just head to saely.com/driver61 or download the app via the link in the description. Now, back to the video. So, the physics of this suspension made perfect sense. The anti-lift geometry should have delivered exactly what Mercedes needed. More consistent rear tyre loading instead of the peaks that cooked their rubber. However, as with McLaren, there is a trade-off. It does make the car more difficult to drive. But more on that later. And I should note that it's not just Mercedes using anti-lift. Ferrari, McLaren and most of the grid are using some version of this because it's just so important. And one problem that Mercedes ran into is that they had evidence that anti-lift was quick. They first tried the anti-lift suspension back in Imola in May, where both drivers actually struggled. So they then quickly dropped it for Monaco and Barcelona. But then came Montreal, where they reintroduced the suspension upgrade. And suddenly, everything looked brilliant. Russell dominated from pole, Antonelli scored his first podium. The team thought they'd finally cracked the code. But Montreal has unique characteristics that hid the suspension's fundamental problems. Antonelli actually explained it well when he said, "In Montreal, you brake straight ahead into the corners, then you just have to find the right turning point to accelerate out of the corner optimally. Our car is good at that." So Montreal is essentially long straights connected by tight chicanes and hairpins, heavy braking in straight lines, then tight cornering. And that's exactly where anti-lift geometry helps the most. You're not asking the suspension to manage complex load changes through flowing corners. It's just brake hard in a straight line and then turn in. But compare that to more traditional circuits with high-speed combined corners where you're braking while turning and managing aero loads constantly changing through long sweepers. And that's where Mercedes couldn't make it work. So the Canadian Grand Prix wasn't proof their upgrade worked. It was proof that they'd found the one track on the calendar that hid their car's weaknesses. But you might be asking yourself, how does a Formula One team that's spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year and has over 1,000 staff make a car that misses the mark by so much? Well, it's all about correlation, from their simulations in the computer to what's actually happening on track. Now, we hear people talk about correlation all the time on the TV, but what does it actually mean? Well, let's talk through how an F1 car is designed and built. Mercedes will design the car in CAD. Then they'll run it through CFD, computational fluid dynamics, basically a digital wind tunnel, to see how all of the aerodynamics work. Then once they have the complete car, they test it around a lap in their offline simulator. Basically a computer driving the car around a virtual lap, in order to see how fast it is. By the way, if you're aiming for a career in motorsport, we're giving away the Aero Advantage Scholarship. It includes our Aerodynamic Unlocked course, one-to-one mentorship with me and Ferrari's ex-head of aerodynamics, Willem Toet, plus loads of extra bonuses worth over £3,400. We're only going to be accepting 10,000 applicants, and early access will close soon. So if you're interested, hit the link below and apply for early entry now. So back to the development process. Merc runs the car in offline simulations, and it's fast. But this is probably where the problem starts. The computer is perfectly precise. It never makes mistakes, and it doesn't need confidence or feedback. If the physics model says the anti-lift suspension makes the car faster, the computer extracts the performance perfectly. But the next step is testing the car in the simulator with a driver. And this is where Russell and Antonelli actually drive the car virtually. And usually here, any difficulty in driving the car is highlighted. But in this case, it wasn't. Otherwise, Mercedes would never have put it on the track. But once it's confirmed at this point, the car then hits the real circuit. The real car, the real track, the real physics, and the real drivers. And suddenly, this suspension was too difficult to drive. Now, Mercedes have been struggling with correlation problems like this since 2022, when they had a big problem with their floor and porpoising. In fact, Toto actually admitted there's a crook somewhere in the system because we're measuring downforce much more than we see on the lap time. So the car had less downforce and was more difficult to drive. It's not the best combination. But how can this make the car so difficult for Russell and Antonelli to drive? Well, as I mentioned before, when you remove the car's natural pitch, the way it moves forward and lifts at the rear, you remove crucial feedback. Drivers rely on this feeling to judge the grip levels and balance between the front and the rear. And unfortunately, it was Antonelli who got hit the hardest. I love watching him drive, it's really exciting to watch, but his aggressive attacking style relies on feeling when the car will stick on corner entry, and the anti-lift geometry removes some of this feedback. In fact, he explained his lack of confidence, saying that, "With my aggressive style, I was making the car even more unpredictable. When I was really trying to push, it was hard to feel if it was going to stick or not." However, George Russell handled it better. His driving style is a bit more precise and more methodical. Where Antonelli relies on aggressive feel-based inputs, Russell's always been smoother and more measured. That precision meant Russell could still extract performance from a car that was quite numb. Now, his results did suffer as well, but he could still get to Q3 and still fight for points. From my own racing experience, confidence in the rear of the car is absolutely critical. If you're coming up to a corner, especially the fast ones, not completely sure of whether the rear is going to stick or not, it's a horrible feeling. And it means that you don't want to get too close to the limit because you don't exactly know where it is. And with that in your mind, you start to leave margin to the limit, and that means you're slow. And we've seen this with Lawson and initially Tsunoda at Red Bull. It was the same problem, struggling with an unpredictable car that removes the driver's confidence. So now Merc have gone back to their old suspension. And having wasted a load of time, money and championship points, the new suspension, as Toto said, is heading for the bin. But that's F1, constantly trying new things to find a tenth of a second. And on this occasion, it didn't work out for Mercedes. Now, as I mentioned briefly, this isn't the first time Mercedes have thought a development was going to be fast and it wasn't. Back at the start of the ground effect cars, they made another huge mistake, which I explain along with an F1 aerodynamicist just here. Thank you so much for watching, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.